Hey everybody. Again, I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person this year. So this is one of a few videos that we're going to show you throughout the trainee program. And I want to start off with talking a little bit about different examples or different styles of science writing or scientific writing. And actually, let me start off with the difference. Scientific writing is often used to describe writing that is published in academic journals for mainly academic audiences. So this here would be considered or is often described as scientific writing. Science writing, on the other hand, often refers to writing that is published for a more general audience, such as newspapers, blogs, in books, etc. So for a much less discipline-specific audience. So this is often referred to as science writing. Now, having said that, some people use these terms interchangeably, so they might say science writing, but they might mean scientific writing. But just that you know, when people usually the writing that most of the writing that you do for in your professional lives would be considered scientific writing. But I do want to show you some examples of science writing, the slightly more accessible writing as well, because I think that there is a trend in scientific writing to really try to be more accessible in their writing, particularly for grant applications, but I think also in journal articles. And in general, it never hurts to say something in a clearer way than in a more complicated way, right? So the less complicated, the clearer, the better. So let's think about academic audiences as the main audience for scientific writing, and let's look at an example. This is from an article from Global Ecology and Biogeography. It's an article from a former colleague of mine at the German university I worked. This is from these folk psychologists. So Global Ecology and Biogeography is obviously a journal that speaks to scientists. And the first thing that we notice that is the hallmark of scientific writing are the many more references, right? So references are certainly a hallmark of scientific writing. I mean, if you look at the language in here, it uses a lot of, or a good number of jargon type of words. And by jargon, I mean very specific words for folks working in geography. So, for example, taxonomic. That is something that the general audience, general population might not understand. Invertebrates is another very sciencey or specific term. This whole, even the first sentence, landscape modification, habit fragmentation have become major research themes in conservation biology. So obviously, these authors are addressing folks who are familiar with conservation biology, particularly with this term of habitat fragmentation. Okay, so right here we get a sense of writing that is pretty much targeted for a very specific audience, an audience that wouldn't have any trouble understanding these terms. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because when you're writing for academic journals, you do need to make sure you speak the quote-unquote language of the field. I think what this introduction still does, it has actually presents the material in fairly accessible language. The sentences aren't too long, so you have first sentence ending here, another sentence ending here. Well, this is a longer one, right? Because it lists a lot of things. But then you have another, and it's another long sentence. So actually, let me stand corrected. Apart from the first sentence, those are pretty lengthy sentences, partially because of the citations in there, but also because it's written for an audience that can handle that. So a good example of scientific writing, writing specifically for science audiences or folks who are familiar with science, the context of the particular science, in this case geology. So a general audience, you have a very different tone in your writing. So let's look at an example from Lives of a Cell by Lewis Thomas, and I've taken this from Intel Teach program, and I've put the URL on the bottom here. So once you have access to the PowerPoints, you can just click on the link. Examples of good science writing. Again, science writing meaning writing for more general public about science. And there's some great examples to look at if you're looking for, if you're interested in writing for a more general audience, or really kind of look at examples of writing that explains very complex scientific concepts in very plain English. It's quite skillful. The example that I've chosen is by Lewis Thomas, Lives of a Cell. It's sort of a classic science writing book. It's a collection of essays by Lewis Thomas, who's a cell biologist, and really explains sort of the main ideas of cell biology to a layperson. So, and if you look at this paragraph, right in the first sentence, you see something that you probably won't see in most scientific writing. So it says here, the microorganisms that seem to have it in for us in the worst way. And I want you to focus in to have it in for us. So there's two things here. First of all, it uses us. And it's, in this context, it's meant, the reader and the writer, or, humanity as a whole. You want to avoid those generalizations in scientific writing when you're writing your more research-based, evidence-based work. Because if you talk about us, it's not really clear who you mean. You can use we talk about personal pronouns a little later, but these generalizations of like, oh, we're all affected by this, and this meaning, whatever you're writing about, that's a very general statement and really doesn't have place in most scientific writing. And then the expression to have it in for somebody, which means that, whatever it is, in this case, microorganisms, really sort of are trying to kind of do something bad to us in this case. It's a very informal expression. Somebody would speak like this, but you wouldn't find this in formal writing. So right in the first sentence, this paragraph gives itself away as really clearly addressing a more general audience. And then if you look at the rest of the paragraph, so the second sentence starts right here. They will invade and replicate if given the chance, and some of them will get into our deepest tissues and set forth in the blood, but it is our response to their presence that makes the disease. Our arsenals for fighting of bacteria are so powerful and involve so many different defense mechanisms that we are in more danger from them than from the invaders. We live in the midst of explosive devices. We are mined. So a lot of play with words, much more of a narrative structure, I would say. And by narrative, I mean it tells a story rather than trying to focus on explaining any kind of previous research done or any kind of references to any other studies like usually we do in our research or scientific writing. So, and the other hallmark, of course, for science writing, meaning it's for a larger audience, there are no citations here, right? No citations whatsoever. So again, just to give you an idea of scientific writing versus science writing, I think a scientist can learn a lot from this kind of writing, from the science writing addressed to a more general audience, to be clearer in their language. But there are some things that in scientific writing you will have to do, like citations and making sure you keep a more objective voice and stand of facts rather than trying to make large generalizations like you see folks doing in science writing. So what I want you to do now for the next few minutes is to compare, and you should have this handout in front of you, a section from a New York Times article with a paragraph from an article in Cell Reports. And you probably have figured out that Cell Reports is an academic journal, whereas the New York Times is not. It's a daily newspaper, one of the most popular, well, one of the most widely read newspapers, certainly in the United States, in the East Coast, if not in the entire United States. Very old, prestigious newspaper. And both sections are about the same topic. So what I want you to do for a few minutes, read over it, and then talk to each other about what is different between those two, because again, they're addressing the same topic. And what kind of differences do you notice? And then we'll continue with the rest of the presentation.